Now, the UN has had much success since it was set up in 1945, but it's also been accused of being too big for its own good, corrupt and in desperate need of reform. Critics say it only acts in the interest of certain powerful nations and that the 5 countries with Security Council veto power have unfair control over the UN agenda. And some UN peacekeepers have been accused of abusing people in communities they were meant to protect. But on the positive side, the UN says the number of people living in extreme poverty has been cut in half since 1990 because of its Millennium Development Goals. And the UN's climate change agreement signed last year in Paris has been hailed as the biggest environmental success in years. For more on this, I'm joined by former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. He's now president of Asia Society Policy Institute and has written a report on UN reform. So let's talk about that report. Kevin Rudd, very good to have you with us, by the way. Why this report, and does this suggest that, in your view, the UN is still relevant?
Well, 2 years ago, the Independent Commission on Multilateralism was established. I've chaired it, and we've spent that period of time going back and looking at basic questions, which is the UN still fit for purpose to meet the demands of 21st century global governance? And the answer is, number one, the UN matters because it's still a fundamental part of the global order. But number two, it's in trouble. And if you look at one issue area after another, you see increasing evidence of people walking around the UN system to find solutions elsewhere or not find them at all. Therefore, for the system to remain relevant to the world's challenges for the future, it must reform. And that's therefore the burden of the report we've just produced.
I should imagine that the United Nations Security Council is pretty high up there, man. If you look at Syria at the moment, and you've got these big powers holding other countries to ransom, if I can put it that way, the standoff between the US and Russia when it comes to Israel, the fact that US, for example, has veto whenever it commits a international act against, the law, the international law. How will that be reformed? What needs to be done there?
Well, the dynamics of Security Council politics will change according to the season and according to the issue. And the reality is it's been that way since 1945. But what my report argues is this: the UN Secretariat, that is the institution itself, when we reach impasses like we've reached, for example, on Syria over the last 5 years, needs itself to begin to act as a bridge builder between the great powers. We can't simply be the price taker for the current state of great power relations or of US-Russia relations. The UN itself needs to build bridges between those positions in order to find a diplomatic outcome, in order to deliver a humanitarian solution. One other point I'd make is this: UN reform is much wider than Security Council reform. Across this vast institution, there are a range of other peace and security bodies, a range of other sustainable development organisations, and a range of other humanitarian agencies, themselves doing reasonable work, but also in need of fundamental reform against preventative diplomacy and against measurable deliverability on the ground. These form the basic principles of the report that we've just concluded.
Is that where accountability is needed? And I'm talking about the peacekeepers here, which I think you touched on. We saw many abuses committed by peacekeepers. How do you instill that?
Well, the bottom line is the UN will be held up to global ridicule if it doesn't adhere to its own high moral standards reflected in the UN Charter. Therefore, zero tolerance on any abuse by UN personnel, peacekeepers or otherwise, against the standards which are expected of them, entrenched in the Charter, and we can and must bring such individuals to justice immediately. More broadly, however, it is about this: the UN is good at delivering normative frameworks, like we've seen on climate change, like we see in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But on the delivery question, which is implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, implementing our actions on climate change, implementing our programs to bring about the end of extreme poverty, we need a new culture of what I describe, a new doctrine of what I describe as delivery. Delivery of programs on the ground through coordinated UN operations under the unified directorship of a director of UN operations in each country, with measurable results and accountability back to the core structures of the UN itself. If we don't have that legitimacy deriving from actual delivery on the ground, then the functional legitimacy of the system begins to corrode over time.
Briefly, if you will, what about a woman at the head?
Oh, look, my position has always been one that this should be occupied by the best qualified person, whoever she or he might be. What the report I've done also recommends, however, is that 50% of all senior management positions in the UN by 2030 should be occupied by women. That, I think, is entirely deliverable. In terms of the current round, for the selection of the Secretary-General, we have many able women who are in the field. Let's see what happens with the final selection process.
Always good to talk to you, Kevin Rudd. Thank you.
Good to be on the program.